Welcome to Academic, a space for thoughtful conversation between two scholars. No headlines, no sound bites, just an exchange of ideas.
So we find ourselves here today talking about alchemy. We both work on alchemy, but from two very different traditions. Myself, I work on the Arabic alchemical tradition, more specifically the medieval Arabic alchemical tradition from the Islamic world. And you work on the Indian tradition of alchemy. So I'd like to begin by asking you, first of all, what got you into this subject?
Yeah, so by training, I'm an Indologist, so somebody who deals with the languages, culture, and history of ancient India. And so my training is philological. I'm a Sanskritist. And so I deal with Sanskritic literature. And for many years, I was focused on Indian medical literature. And I noticed, so Indian medical literature is roughly 2,000 years old. And a lot of work on Indian medical literature focuses on the earliest scriptures. But I was looking at the question of change in Indian medicine. And sort of around the 10th century, 11th century, I noticed that new substances were being introduced to Indian medicine, including mercury. And I was sort of wondering why this change happened. And it is just at that time that a new genre of literature emerges on the Indian subcontinent. And this is alchemical literature. So I started with the idea that basically these changes in Indian medicine had to do with some sort of communication between alchemical practitioners and medical practitioners who might have been the same people. But that certainly this change was to do with some sort of communication between these worldviews and ways of dealing with substances. And so then I started a project that was funded by the European Research Council. And I was looking at sort of the interactions between Indian alchemy, Indian medicine, and also yoga traditions. And so that project ran from 2015 to 2020. And so I got very interested in the alchemical tradition through this project. And it's a very open field because not much work has been done yet on Indian alchemy at all. So it's a bit of a pioneering work. And so that's how I got into the topic. And how about yourself? What sparked your interest in Arabic alchemy?
Well, my journey was a rather unusual one. But I suppose, like many others, the history of alchemy is not something I trained in. It's not something I began life as an academic in. My background is in history. I started out as a historian interested in religion, namely Christian communities that lived in the medieval Islamic world. What today you would call minorities, perhaps, but of course the medieval Islamic world was diverse. You had Muslim-ruled lands, where one could find numerous communities of Christians, Jews, and even pagans at one point. So we're talking about multilingual societies, multi-religious ones. And I was particularly interested in the migration of ideas, theological ideas, but also philosophical ideas. I wrote my PhD on a 13th century bishop of the Syriac church named Abdisho Barbricha. Actually, he dies in the early 14th century. He wrote in Arabic and Syriac. And most of the sources I study are Arabic, classical Arabic. That's also part of my training as a historian, reading texts. This bishop wrote numerous theological works. He wrote works of canon law. He even wrote works of poetry. But he also wrote about alchemy. And I suspect he was also a practicing alchemist. And that was my gateway into alchemy. in a way. And it's taken me on a remarkable journey of reading texts that I'd never read before, but also reading texts that have never been edited or translated before. And you talked about pioneering work. This is also the case with Arabic alchemy, which is woefully understudied. So it's a very exciting field to be in right now, I would say.
Yes, and I was wondering, so we're using the word alchemy as if we mean the same thing, but maybe we don't. And so could you characterize what Arabic alchemy is about?
So I'll begin with two things. First, the word alchemy. Our word in English derives from an Arabic word, alchemia, which in turn derives from the Greek chemeia. And there are all kinds of theories about where the Greeks got the word. And in the context of the medieval Islamic world, alchemy was a discipline which was chiefly interested in the manipulation and transformation of matter, namely metals. And it's often understood as the science of transmutation, right? Today, perhaps we would understand it as such. Transforming one kind of metal into another, the ultimate goal being the manufacture of gold. And this goes back to the popular understanding of alchemy as the creation of gold from base metals like lead. In the medieval Arabic tradition, the discipline traces its origins from Greek alchemy, which emerged not in ancient Greece, but in Roman Egypt in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. Recent research has argued that alchemy in Roman Egypt, which was largely Greek-speaking, had its origins in temple practice, namely the colorization of statues, which involved tincturing metals of statues used in ritual in order to seem more lifelike. This work was as metallurgical as it was ritualistic, and was carried out by temple priests. Now, this is important to Arabic alchemy because medieval Arab authors were aware of this, and they would often characterize alchemy as a science that emerged from ancient Egypt, or what they understood as ancient Egypt. And it's a discipline which continues to develop and innovate and thrive in Muslim-ruled lands in the Middle East, but also as far west as Islamic Spain and as far east as Central Asia. So this is what I mean often when I'm referring to alchemy, in particular Arabic alchemy. And just to add to that briefly, what do I mean by Arabic alchemy? You might think, and some viewing this may think, hold on, Arabic is a language. It's not a culture or an ethnicity or a national signifier. But I use Arabic alchemy very deliberately here, meaning any alchemical text in the Arabic language. Okay. Some people refer to it as Islamic alchemy because it was produced in Muslim-ruled lands in the Middle Ages. But of course, you didn't have to be a Muslim to write in the Arabic language. And this goes back to my initial point about how diverse and multi-religious these medieval Islamic societies tended to be. And of course, many authors themselves who were involved in philosophy, medicine in the medieval Islamic world were not Muslim. And of course, many were. And this can also be applied to alchemy. So that's why I choose to refer to the discipline as Arabic alchemy.
I've heard the term Islamicate alchemy used a lot. Would that serve, or is that the problem that it's also different religious groups that were involved in the practice of alchemy? How do you feel about Islamicate?
Islamicate also really encapsulates this idea of what I'm talking about, which is to say that when we're dealing with a subject like alchemy, or shall we say, philosophy or medicine in the medieval Islamic world, we have to acknowledge that it's not uniquely Muslim. Yeah. It's not uniquely practiced by a Muslim. So in that sense, it's not strictly Islamic in the way that, say, theology or Islamic jurisprudence was. But it's Islamicate because it belongs to a broader cultural matrix of societies that were part of a commonwealth, right? Yeah. And a cultural commonwealth. And what was one of the common denominators of this cultural commonwealth? The Arabic language, which very much functions as a lingua franca and vehicle for science, much as Latin in medieval Christian Europe.
Yeah, so and Sanskrit for the Indian world, or the Indic cultural realm,
which I also understand to be transconfessional.
That's right.
Yes, in a sense that it becomes a language of prestige on the subcontinent.
It's a scholarly language. Yeah. It's also, of course, the language of various religions, predominantly for various Hindu faiths, but it is also used in Buddhism. So we have source texts in Buddhism that are in Pali, but also then for Mahayana schools, Sanskrit. So it's and then it is also part of the sort of Indic cosmopolis. So, sort of as Indic culture spreads throughout Asia, Sanskrit is the language that is used to communicate content. Yeah. So Indian alchemy is later than Islamicate or Arabic alchemy, as I understand it. It's a sort of late development within Indian culture. When I say alchemy, there is, no connection to the word alchemy through alchemia in the Indian context. It's there's various words used by alchemists themselves to describe their discipline. And usually it's something that involves the word rasa. That's a Sanskrit word that has many different meanings, but in the context of Indian alchemy usually means mercury, sometimes essence. And then you have the word mercury plus something that means doctrine or school or knowledge. So we have words like rasavada, the doctrine of mercury, or rasa vidya, the knowledge or the science of mercury. So these kinds of words are used to describe the tradition. When there was Persianate presence in India, they would use the word rasayana to describe the science. The word rasayana is also a Sanskrit word, but was not really used by Indian alchemists to describe their discipline as a whole, but rather sort of the end stage of alchemical production. So what Indian alchemists did was they focused on mercury to begin with, and the idea was to make an elixir, a tonic, and this tonic could be used to apply it to metals and then to make gold, for example, or silver, but that was never seen as the end goal. So transmutation is at the heart of the alchemical endeavor on the Indian subcontinent. But this making of gold is sort of a side project. It's rather used to then prove that the elixir is efficacious. So if you can make gold with the elixir, that means it's also ready to be applied to the human. And that is the whole point of the alchemical endeavor. So then somebody is given the elixir, and we don't actually know whether it was the practitioner who made the elixir or somebody else. And so then there's a whole phase in which the person who's going to consume the elixir has sort of medical treatments to ready the body and to make the person ready for the experience that they will have on taking the elixir. And then this sort of period of transformation that the consumer of the elixir goes through. And this period, this sort of, I call it the elixir regimen phase of alchemy, is called Rasayana by Indian alchemical practitioners in their texts. And the word already appears earlier in Indian medical texts. So 1,000 years earlier, in the earliest of the Sanskrit medical texts, Rasayana is one of 8 parts of medicine. And it's a part of medicine that is to do with rejuvenation and anti-aging and sort of strengthening the body, vitalization. And so alchemists use this originally medical term to describe what they're now doing with the elixir. The goals are a little bit different. So longevity is also one of the alchemical goals, but they go a bit further and say that the consumer can experience special powers like flying and so on by taking the elixir, but they may also become immortal through taking the potions, or they may even experience godhood. This is usually in a Hindu context, where the highest god is a god called Shiva. And so they might experience likeness with Shiva, become like Shiva, become Shiva himself, become the absolute. So it's a transcendent experience that the practitioner will have. And, this whole idea of immortality, transcendence, and so on, that's the sort of hallmark of Indian alchemy, of early Indian alchemy. And then quite soon, it becomes quite medical. So then you can use it, well, for rejuvenation, anti-aging, but also against a cough, for example. So, and I think that's the biggest difference to Arabic or Greco-Egyptian alchemy, as far as I can see it, that this goal of making gold is there in the Indian tradition, but really it's more medical, and then also these transcendent goals. It's sort of the difference between the two traditions, I would say.
You talked about Indian alchemy being somewhat a later development than Greco-Egyptian and Arabic alchemy. When would you say is the definitive moment when Indian alchemy emerges, begins to develop and kind of reach a mature stage?
It's really difficult to say for the reason that we have trouble dating the literature. But roughly we think around the 10th century, might be a little bit earlier. Very often in Indian history, if we're thinking about history based on literature, we sort of plus 200 years, minus 200 years. So some think that some of the earliest works are dated to the 8th century. There's one medical work that dates to the 9th century, and we're fairly certain about the dating of this work, which already has alchemical content, so this sort of special vocabulary and so on, ways of using mercury and manipulating mercury and other materials. And so that would be 9th century. We have mentions of alchemical practice, but it's more sort of miracle stories that go back to the 5th century, and then some mention in the 7th century, and especially of a figurehead of Mercury, a person called Nagarjuna. There's a Buddhist philosopher called Nagarjuna, and this is not he. So it's an alchemist called Nagarjuna who appears all over the literature and so on. So we have some stories by Chinese pilgrims who comes to India in the 7th century and sort of then retells some of the stories. But these are stories of, Nagarjuna came and used a potion and then turned a mountain into gold, right? And so these kinds of narratives. And we have some satirical accounts of possibly alchemical procedures in some plays. But then the sort of alchemy as described by alchemists themselves, again, 9th, 10th century, around that time. So this is late, of course, for Indian culture. We have, Indian literature that is, 2,000 years older. Medical literature is roughly 1,000 years older, again, with the difficulty of actually dating the texts, So we're always a little bit out by a few centuries. And, this is a tradition that immediately uses vocabulary from medicine, and it also uses Indian culture. So it describes itself, for example, the second oldest work describes itself as revealed literature. The god Shiva speaks to the goddess, his consort, and she asks him about alchemy. And he says, well, let me tell you about alchemy. And so then all the procedures are basically divine knowledge that is being transmitted. The oldest work doesn't quite do that. There, an alchemical practitioner called Govinda tells his king about this and refers to the king as an alchemical expert. So we see that this is an established tradition already at that time, a discipline that's quite technical at that time. So so at some time between the 7th and the 10th century, there must have been a shift in how this discipline was understood and maybe regarded by society, to be then sort of instituted as something that deserved its own literature. So suddenly then we have the production of Sanskrit works, and there's quite a few. There's quite a big literature, and also quite a wide dissemination of these works. So I wouldn't say that alchemy ever became very mainstream, but certainly it became a pan-Indic phenomenon that was understood also by the public. And we get sort of references to it by onlookers, by travelers to India and so on, that there is this established tradition. Yeah, how about for Arabic alchemy? I've been wondering a little bit about the sort of status. You were mentioning the connection to Egypt and to pigments used for statues of deities. Was that not problematic in the Islamic world? Sort of, wouldn't it have been seen as heathen science?
Well, that's really interesting because Arab authors had a way of reconciling this issue, that alchemy, as they would always acknowledge, was a revealed science, but it was also a primordial one. It was an ancient one. And there were a number of ways that was conceptualized within this thought world. One of them was to say that it was a science revealed by prophets. Yeah. The question is, which prophets? Often they tended to be these antediluvian prophets, which is to say they came before the biblical and Quranic prophets, namely Hermes Trismegistus, who is a figure that emerges again from Roman Egypt in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, that is very much tied to the local deity Thoth, and also associated with the Greco-Roman god Mercury. He coalesces into Hermes Trismegistus, and he's a very important figure in early Hermeticism in late antique Roman Egypt. Becomes a figure associated with both magical practice, but also certain metaphysical systems and cosmologies. Now, when Hermeticism comes into Arabic thoughts in the early Middle Ages, Hermes continues to develop as a mythical figure, and he becomes, if you like, a prophet of science. He becomes a kind of pre-Mosaic prophet to the Arabs who revealed the divine crafts of alchemy, but also astrology and talisman making. Right. So this is one way of doing it. And Hermes was argued by many Islamic thinkers to have been mentioned in the Quran. He is often associated with the prophet Idris, who is said to have been raised to heaven while still alive. And there's one author from the 10th century, a native of Islamic Spain, Maslam al-Qurtubi. He was a native of Cordoba, modern Cordoba, and he cites this verse from the Quran that mentions Idris's ascension. And he makes this firm association with Hermes Trismegistus, and he says, by being raised to the heavens. He was being raised to these higher intelligences, you know, and had revealed to him these divine arts of talisman making and alchemy. So associating these pre-Islamic figures with figures from the Quran was one way of, if you like, naturalizing a discipline like alchemy into a broader Islamic cultural framework. But there was also another strategy used by Arab alchemists, which was connected to the first one I laid out, which was to talk about the antiquity of alchemy. Now, if something is old and continuous, then it must be reliable, and of course, it must be venerable and worthy of respect. And one author who typifies this approach was Muhammad ibn Umayl, who also flourished in the 10th century. And he talks about Egypt being the cradle of alchemy, being a land of wisdom, a land of, innovation. He talks about the temples of Egypt, which by his time, as now, were ruins. But of course, a curious visitor could walk into these ruins and read the images on its walls, which of course would have been hieroglyphs. And many such writers came to the conclusion that these images, these temple images, were alchemical ciphers, right? And that they embodied ancient wisdom. So this is very much a theme you get in such writers. And there's this idea that alchemy is a hieratic art, which is to say that it was practiced by these temple priests who passed on this wisdom, from the earliest times to the present day. So by talking about alchemy as a continuous and venerable tradition, you're basically establishing its respectability and its credibility. I'll also add that you also have a number of writers who attribute to alchemy many associations from Shia Islam. And actually, this is something that becomes a very prominent feature of alchemy. One that remains to this day, and we can talk about this later, of course, is passed on to the Christian West. And this is the idea of alchemy as an occult science. It is hidden, right? Now, there are some Egyptian, Greek, and Byzantine antecedents to this, but it continues to develop and in new directions in the Islamic period. So it's this idea that, yes, alchemy is an occult science. It's a science that attends to hidden properties of matter, right? And what you're doing by creating gold is you're extracting from within a base metal its inner purity and bringing it to the surface. So the term for this inner essence is batin, hidden, inner, and it's being brought to the surface, thereby becoming zahir, which means manifest. Now, this is language that is also very common in Shia religious discourse, which talks about the imam of the Muslims as being hidden in occultation, but he becomes manifest in times of need, on the Day of Judgment, for example. the 12th Imam, who returns from his occultation. It's also a term associated with Islamic esotericism. For example, the interpretation of the Quran has many layers. There is an outer or zahir interpretation, but there's also an esoteric interpretation, batin, right? And it takes a sage, one whose intellect is well cultivated, to bring out that hidden meaning. And again, this is language that is applied as much to alchemy as it is Islamic religious discourse, particularly Islamic esotericism. So just that, you know, to answer your question about how was this squared within a kind of Muslim framework, these are some of the ways.
Yeah, I mean, for the Indian alchemical tradition being a little bit late, you know, using this device of revelation, so all knowledge is present at all times, but we don't always have access to it. And that's the sort of general idea that can be applied to things that otherwise would seem new, because newness is not seen as something favorable in the Indic traditions. So knowledge is good if it is ancient, if it is always there, especially if it is revealed. So the ideas, for example, of modern science, of experimentation and new insight and so on, are not something that is valued in this tradition, rather something that is true because it has divine origin or because it has always been there. There's something that is valued. And so for the alchemical tradition, they never say outright, oh, well, now here is something that you have not heard before. I mean, of course, in the works where it's a dialogue between God and goddess, and the goddess asks him about it, you know, clearly this is something that she has not heard before in this conversation. But as a reader of the text, you're not confronted with something that is considered to be a new development, though, you know, in historical terms it is. We don't have these descriptions of these processes before. And one of the sort of odd things about Indian alchemy is sort of this centrality of mercury. It's a quicksilver, Hg. It's very odd because we don't actually have mercury on the Indian subcontinent. So it seems to me that this would be a tradition that must have come from the outside, simply because of this use of a material that was from the outside. They would have had access to mercury from what is today Afghanistan, and also from Tibet and China. Maybe there were small amounts of mercury in India that would explain this use, but it's still quite puzzling to have, you know, this whole system of using a material that has no presence, you know, it's just physically on the subcontinent. But the whole worldview that is built around this use is really naturalized through its embedding in a Shaiva context, so referring to the god Shiva, very often in the fierce form of Shiva that is called Bhairava, and then his consort is Bhairavi. And so they embed it within a sort of broadly tantric worldview, a stream of Hinduism that sort of started around the 7th century of the Common Era in India. And so we get this alchemy embedded in this form of Hinduism, and it makes sense in itself. You know, when you sort of think about how, you know, mercury is described as the essence of Shiva, as a sort of a manifestation of Shiva, and so on. That is why it's so important, and that it is also why it has its potency, and so on. But all these ways of dealing with this material are also new. And, you know, this idea of transmutation, but also this idea of that you can't just use a raw material, but that you need to treat it in certain ways to make it usable, to perfect it, to purify it, to make it applicable to a human. This is also a new idea, and there's never any explanation of where this comes from. So in Indian medicine, we have the use of metals, for example, already earlier, and they're doing some procedures. But they use very different terms and to explain, or rather they don't explain what they're doing. And now in alchemical literature, and then later in the newer medical literature. It's all about, purification. So purification becomes a sort of very important word in this, but also the killing of mercury, the reviving of mercury and of other materials as well. So this is this new vocabulary. And this is where I wonder whether maybe one could find some connections between Indic alchemy and then maybe the Greco-Egyptian and Arabic traditions, because otherwise I would see two broad streams of alchemy, and one being the Greco-Egyptian, Arabic, and then European alchemy. And on the other side, traditions that grew in Asia, starting in China, and then also in India at a later stage, with Tibet as a sort of middle point between them. You have a sort of Tibetan alchemy that is syncretic, uses Sanskritic materials, but also Chinese ones. And then, a whole area in Asia where we know nothing about alchemical traditions. There would be very interesting to see what the connections would be there. But I think there must have also been connections, when I look at the Indian tradition, these whole ideas about immortality, elixirs and so on, that seems to me to be very cognate with the Chinese traditions. But we also have sort of stories and then just technologies and techniques that I think we might find more commonalities with the Arabic traditions than we know about at present. Earlier this morning, we were discussing some alchemical themes, stories, and sort of, where does mercury come from? How do we harvest it, mine it, but, harvest it and so on, that I think there we might see some interesting connections between the traditions.
Yeah, it seems to me that Arabic alchemy, which is, a cognate, if you like, with very similar to what becomes medieval Latin alchemy, and these two traditions of alchemy in the West, compared to Indian alchemy and Chinese alchemy, strike me as very different traditions, almost discrete traditions, and yet they have so much in common. Yeah. Right.
And it's the practices that they have in common, what they actually do with the materials, this whole idea of sublimation, the kinds of pots they would use, in the Indian tradition, maybe there isn't so much use of glass, so you don't have a glass retort, for example, but other than that, this whole idea of distillation, sublimation, calcination, and the actual procedures, and I think even a lot of the materials used for doing so, there's a lot of overlap. There's also differences, but certainly I think it's in the technologies that I see a lot of commonality.
And what seems different in a really interesting way is the theory. So you talked about the centrality of mercury.
Yes.
In the Arabic tradition, one of the great leaps forward from Greco-Roman and Byzantine alchemy was the theorization of how metals come to be. If you like, metallogenesis, the birth of metals. And this theory becomes the bedrock of alchemical practice. It informs alchemical practice. And this is what becomes known as the mercury-sulfur theory. So yes, like in the Indian tradition, mercury is very important to the Arabic alchemical practice, but also sulfur.
But the real materials, mercury and sulfur, these are not metaphors for series of characteristics of
this is
materials?
A good question, and different authors have different approaches to this, but by and large, mercury and sulfur are principles as much as actual materials. So a lot of this comes from creative adaptations of Aristotle's account for how metals come to be in his meteorology. And in this work, Aristotle talks about metals. And by metals, this is something specific here. It's fusible metals. It's those metals that have a tendency to take a molten state when subjected to heat. He talks about them having their origin in a watery substance or being water-like. And then he talks about exhalations in subterranean caverns that, if you like, give birth, so to speak, to metals. You have moist exhalations and dry exhalations, if you like, vaporous exhalations that are coming, that are taking place in these caverns, caused by the heat of the sun, and you have dry, smoky exhalations. Each of these types of actions give rise to different types of metal. He doesn't name them all, right? What happens much later in the Islamic period, so around the 9th century AD, you have a text called Sirr al-Khaliqa. Sirr al-Khaliqa meaning the secret of creation, and it is falsely attributed to Apollonius of Tyana, a famous Pythagorean philosopher of Greek antiquity. But it's not by him, it's an original Arabic composition. It's a cosmological work. It contains the famous emerald tablet legend, as above, so below, which comes at the end of the work, and is said to be the wisdom of Hermes, Trismegistos again, inscribed on an emerald tablet, and it's the secret of nature, of creation. So this work is not an alchemical work, but it is a cosmological work, and a section of it accounts for the creation of metals in nature, and it talks about these exhalations that I just mentioned, that are talked about by Aristotle, interacting with mercury and sulfur in subterranean caverns. One gives rise to sulfur, the other to mercury, sulfur being the drier, hotter principle, mercury being the more moist and cold. Then the two come together.
Yes.
Right? So actually mercury is the first substance to be formed. But as it forms, it merges with sulfur, right? And its moistness is buried within the sulfur. And when the two come together, they form different ratios of mercury and sulfur, and these ratios in turn give rise to different metals. The first of them being lead, and then you get the others, of course, tin, copper, iron, silver, gold, mercury, quicksilver in this case, the 7 metals that were known to both Greek and Arab alchemists.
So the prime mercury is different from the quicksilver that comes later on in the line of things that are created.
Which is the metal that can be processed. So the idea here is that all metals are made of varying ratios of mercury and sulfur. Their pairing is often symbolized as a marriage. So mercury is important, but so is sulfur. And the work of the alchemist, so this is the secrets of creation. It's talking merely about the formation. And it's also talking about this pairing of mercury and sulfur as being most balanced in gold. So the idea is that the most balanced proportions of these two yield gold. But what happens when metals emerge is that impurities enter them. And this balance of mercury sulfur is offset and is something that leads to baser metals like tin or copper or lead. The work of the alchemist, so this comes later in an author named Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as Geber in the West. He is profoundly influenced by the secret of creation, by the emerald tablet. And he's one of the first to say that the work of the alchemist is to restore that balance.
Yeah.
The work of the imbalance is to correct where nature went wrong, in a sense, by correcting the impurities of base metals in order to bring out their inner goldness, right? And again, this goes back to interpretations of this text, The Secret of Creation, which talks about all metals being in potentiality gold, right? And the challenge is to bring out this inner batin, as I said in Arabic before, goldness or purity to the surface. Yeah, the role of the alchemist in the Arabic tradition is often said to be like that of a physician. It is to restore the balance of metals, much as you might restore the balance of humours in a human body.
Yeah.
And there is, in many ways, a theoretical link between the practice of medicine in the medieval Arabic-speaking world and the practice of alchemy. And of course, you've spoken a lot about Indian alchemy's connection to medicine. I understand that Ayurvedic practices are still very widespread.
That's right.
In India. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how alchemy relates to that in terms of modern day reception.
Yeah, so just going back to the origins of alchemy, they use medical vocabulary and medical ideas about preparing the body for the intake of the elixir, but then also these later the elixirs become medicine. So if before you became immortal, later you can cure leprosy or so with the use of these elixirs. And the formulations go into medical literature, into Ayurvedic literature. So you will have all the herbal remedies and so on, and then the 10th recipe might be a mercurial one or one that uses other materials that first were sort of used in alchemical contexts. And so the Ayurvedic tradition is still present in India today. It's part of public health in India. So we have a biomedical setup that is similar to what we have, here in Sweden. But we also have indigenous forms of medicine, and Ayurveda is one of them, one of several. So we also have the Greco-Arabic medicine, Unani, for example. We have a southern Indian tradition called Tamil Siddha medicine, which is similar to the alchemical tradition, in fact, in its use of materials. And so the Ayurvedic tradition is still present in India today. You can become an Ayurvedic doctor. You study at university. It's 4 years of study to get a basic degree of Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery. And so as part of this kind of official medical setup, alchemy lives on in the formulations that were brought into Ayurvedic literature at this time, 10th to 16th century, sort of. So we have all these formulations. There's a big Ayurvedic pharmaceutical industry in India. And so you can go to a pharmacy and get over-the-counter products or things prescribed by your Ayurvedic doctor. And some of these formulations will be formulations that were first brought together in an alchemical work from the 10th century, or from the 12th century, and so on. So alchemy, we don't think of it sort of, Indians don't think of this as alchemy. They think of it as chemical medicine. And it's a really big part of Ayurvedic education now. So Ayurvedic pharmacology, which is, sort of 80%, and I'm making up the percentage, but, to a large extent, it's about herbal medicine. But anything that has minerals and metals, inorganic substances in it, in likelihood goes back to the alchemical tradition. So today you can buy a medicine that, has a formulation that is 1,000 years old and was first revealed by the god Shiva to the goddess. And so I think this is a continuity that we don't have so much for the Arabic alchemical tradition and so on. So it lives on in India. as it does also in Tibet. And there's also traditions in Myanmar, for example, alchemical traditions. So maybe that's another difference, that we still have this sort of medicalized alchemy as something that is still being used by consumers in Asia today. Thank you for this very interesting conversation.
And thank you too. I learnt a great deal.